With the success of Final Fantasy IV for the Super Famicom and Final Fantasy II for the Super NES, Hironobu Sakaguchi had it made. With his legacy now firmly established, he was then offered a promotion to executive producer at Square Enix. While anyone in their right mind would take such a promotion when it was offered to them, that of course meant he would have to step down from active game development. As a result, the game I am reviewing today will be his last Final Fantasy game. Released on December 6, 1992 in Japan for the Super Famicom, and on September 30th, 1999 for the PlayStation 1 in North America as part of the Final Fantasy Anthology re-release, which is the version I will be reviewing today, this game marks the end of the Sakaguchi era. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Final Fantasy V Retrospective. I want to start off by making a fairly controversial statement. As I mentioned earlier, this is Sakaguchi's last game, and that means this is his last chance to leave a good impression on the Final Fantasy franchise. But he also has no more excuses for his failure to make a good game. He has 4 Final Fantasy games under his belt, so he can't argue that this is an untested formula, like when he was making Final Fantasy I. He should know what works about this series and what doesn't by now. In addition to that, the Famicom cartridges that this game was going to be made on can hold 2.5 megabytes of data. To put that in perspective, Final Fantasy IV's cartridge could hold 1 megabyte of data. Final Fantasy V has 1.5 megabytes more data to work with than what Final Fantasy IV had. Now, bear in mind that the series, at least at this point, does not use voice acting. The story is conveyed entirely through text. That being said, do you have any idea how much story you can pack into a game with 1.5 megabytes if you just use text? Well, I actually ran an experiment. I took my PDF copy of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, that's the longest of the Harry Potter novels, and I copied and pasted the entire thing into MS Notepad, which is a text-only app. The resulting file was 1.53 megabytes. Okay, that's a little more than 1.5 megabytes, but considering that A, it's the longest of the Harry Potter novels, and B, that copy and paste job most likely included irrelevant characters like page numbers or the margins at the top that remind you what chapter you're on, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this Super Famicom cartridge has given Sakaguchi the same amount of cartridge space as Final Fantasy IV, plus an extra 1.5 megabytes of additional space for him to essentially go buck wild with the story. In short, Sakaguchi is now officially 110% out of excuses. He has the experience. He has the fan feedback on what does and doesn't work about the franchise. He has more than enough cartridge space and processing power in the hardware to tell nearly any story he wants, and I'd imagine at this point he would have the clout within Square to be given the creative freedom to make practically any game he wanted with almost no publisher oversight. Otherwise, why would he be offered the promotion that caused this to be his last game? In short, no more punches are being pulled on my end. If Sakaguchi can't make a good Final Fantasy game now, he can't make a good Final Fantasy game, period. So, that begs the question, is Final Fantasy V a good game? Well, watch the rest of this retrospective video to find out. So anyway, while Sakaguchi was the director for this game, and receives top billing in the in-game credits, it is said that a good chunk of the story's comic relief was written by a guy named Yoshinori Kitase, a man who would go on to be the director for the story for the next 3 Final Fantasy games, 6, 7, and 8, before likewise getting promoted to an executive position at Square. Kitase felt the story for Final Fantasy V was way too serious, and since he was being bred as Sakaguchi's successor to carry on the Final Fantasy franchise, Sakaguchi eventually decided to let Kitase dip his toes and write a few comic relief scenes. It's nice that Sakaguchi was such a good sport about this. In any event, this game was released in Japan on December 6, 1992, which fell on a Sunday. As a fun little side story, it is rumored that the Japanese authorities had specifically requested that Square release the game on a Sunday so that Japanese kids would not skip school to get it on release day. I have no idea if that's true or not, but it is definitely a funny story. Then there was the localization. While the development for the Japanese version of this game was more or less a smooth process by video game development standards, the localization efforts underwent several years of development hell. Now, Final Fantasy II and III had their localizations delayed because they had difficulty translating the story from Japanese to English while still keeping the game confined to the extremely limited cartridge space of the time. See my Final Fantasy II retrospective for more details. But with Final Fantasy V, as I mentioned earlier, cartridge space limitations were not a problem anymore. They had plenty of cartridge space to work with, so what was their excuse this time around for not bringing the game to North America just a few months after it was released in Japan? Well, the general consensus is that Square initially believed that we stupid Americans just wouldn't be able to cope with the intense difficulty that this game provided. It was supposedly a huge step up in difficulty from Final Fantasy IV, and that game already had to have its difficulty reduced when it was released in North America. See my Final Fantasy IV retrospective for more details. So they assumed, without any evidence to back it up, that Final Fantasy V would likewise just be too hard for simple American brains. Gee, way to make your country's largest trading partner feel appreciated! Thanks for the vote of confidence, you racists! However, this was in the year 1993. By this point, the internet existed. While it wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now, it was steadily gaining popularity. So, for the first time, American people were able to send emails to Japanese people. So American gamers contacted Square in Japan and were like, "Hey motherfuckers, we're not fucking inbred illiterate hicks. You better give us an English Final Fantasy V before we nuke you again." Square responded to the demand for an English version of the game by agreeing to release it as a standalone game unrelated to the Final Fantasy series. Wow! For a supposedly polite society, Japan sure seems to be a master at making snide insults at other countries, even when that country is their country's largest trading partner. Of course, even that localization effort was scrapped for unknown reasons. There were some rumors that the game was going to be released in North America as Final Fantasy Extreme, thereby providing a disclaimer about its intense difficulty so the fans would know what they're getting themselves into when they buy the game. Okay, I suppose that's slightly less insulting than saying our puny little American brains are just incapable of coping with the difficulty of the game, but Jesus Christ, guys! A disclaimer about the game's difficulty? That's what reviews are for! Just release it as Final Fantasy V, or at the very least, Final Fantasy III, since that would be the appropriate numbering in the North American line of games. That would have been fine too! But you know what? Even those plans for localization got scrapped for unknown reasons. Following that, a PC translation was attempted by Top Dog Software, and cancelled for unknown reasons. Another localization attempt was made by Eidos Interactive, cancelled for unknown reasons. By this point, the American fans were at their wits' end. It was 1998, 6 years after the game was released in Japan. The game was, for all intents and purposes, finished and just needed to be brought over to North America. So they finally decided to take matters into their own hands. Somebody got a hold of a copy of the PC port of the game, translated it into English, and started circulating it on the internet. At this point, Square's back was to the wall. The fans had their English version of the game. The only problem was that it was a version that Square could not profit from in any way, shape, or form. So they might as well hurry up and release an official English version of the game so they can at least make some money off of it. So, with no other options left, they eventually buckled down and made a port for the PlayStation 1. To be released on September 30th, 1999, as part of the 3-pack release Final Fantasy Anthology, which also included Final Fantasy IV and VI. Unlike the first North American release of Final Fantasy II, this time around it actually made sense for it to be released on the PS1, since in 1999, the PS1 really was the current console. Well, the 1999 PS1 remake is the version I will be reviewing today, because as I said in the Final Fantasy IV retrospective, I'm reviewing the first versions of these games to be released in an official capacity in North America. So, without any further ado, let's dive into the game itself, starting with the first thing you see in the game. Just like with Final Fantasy II, this game feels the need to start off with a fully 3D cutscene, even though the rest of the game, even its cutscenes, are only going to be in 16-bit. Once again, I fail to see the point. All this does is set our expectations higher than what the game is actually going to deliver. If you just want to make a 16-bit game, just make a 16-bit game, but don't tease us with the promise of 3D graphics if you're not going to deliver the goods. On top of that, who even is this chick? The way she's walking around the castle and looking out the window suggests that she's supposed to be Rina immediately before the opening cutscene of the game itself. However, this woman has brown hair, whereas Rina has pink hair, so it can't possibly be Rina in this cutscene. Now, for a 16-bit game, the graphics are okay. They're not great, even by 16-bit standards, but they are adequate. I just have one question though, what's with this weird-ass black box on the sides of the screen? Here's a clip of some footage without the blurriness, stretchiness, or red box that I normally use when making these videos. I'm including some red margins so you can easily make out where the boundaries are. As you can see, there's a weird black box on the edges of the screen, and I don't understand why. It's like there are entire sections of the screen that the game could be using to convey important information to the player that they simply aren't making any use of. Bear in mind that this is before HD, meaning that every pixel mattered when it came to making the most efficient use of on-screen real estate. So for them to actively forego the use of these borders and do literally nothing with them is baffling to me. Notwithstanding the bizarre choice of not using the borders for any purpose, the overworld itself looks about on par with that of Final Fantasy IV. However, considering that this is supposed to be the next leap forward, the fact that it is merely on par with the graphics of the previous game is not exactly high praise. The battle screens, for the most part, are similarly on par with those of Final Fantasy IV, except for one. The battle screen that pops up when you enter a battle while on an open grasslands terrain looks like complete crap. The grass just looks like a solid green color. The trees and lakes look like they aren't even fully rendered properly. It honestly looks like one of those old Apple II games from the mid-1980s. You know, the ones that boasted a whopping 16 colors in their color palette? In fact, the only part of this battle screen that looks fully rendered is the mountains in the background. Yes, the objects that are supposed to be the farthest away and therefore would have an excuse for not being fully rendered seem like the most amount of effort was put into them. Fuck me. Then we have the music. As I've gone out of my way to make clear in the past, I am not a big fan of Nobuo Uematsu's musical talents. However, I was willing to concede that he did an alright job in Final Fantasy IV. Once again, he does an alright job here. The music tends to invoke a nice sense of adventure, as well as a sense of urgency when the plot demands it. However, because this is Uematsu we're talking about, and as I've mentioned before, Uematsu is a shit composer, there are a few parts in this game when this soundtrack falls flat on its ass. For starters, the music for the Library of the Ancients is... ugh! Here, have a listen. Oh my god. It sounds like Uematsu just put some spitballs in some straws, blindfolded himself, shot the spitballs at a blank piece of sheet music, and whichever lines they landed on ended up being the notes he would play for this score. However, the most egregious example of Uematsu's lack of musical talent comes in the regular battle music. It starts out okay, invoking a nice sense of urgency as enemies attack you. But after the first few notes, it goes completely off the rails. That music does not invoke any sense of urgency. This makes the battles feel more like a choreographed dance routine than a struggle for survival against wild beasts. Now, with the boss fight music, I tend to get a perilous battle to the death vibe. But the regular fight music just doesn't cut it for me. This is an even more egregious example of Uematsu dropping the ball than with the Library of the Ancients. That music might be ear-splitting, but there's only 3 times in the game when I have to listen to it. The battle music pops up every few minutes all throughout the game. However, if it's any consolation, let me counter that by saying that the theme music for X-Death, the main villain of this game, is absolutely badass. When this music plays, I always found myself watching with bated breath to see what kind of destruction was coming. This is one instance where the music makes the bad guy. So the score in this game is hit or miss. Once in a while it's awesome, sometimes it's okay, and sometimes it just sucks. Final Fantasy IV introduced the Active Time Battle system, a sort of middle ground between turn-based combat and real-time combat. In my retrospective of that game, I mentioned how this combat system turned the turn-based combat into an overly chaotic clusterfuck of a mess. I couldn't make more than a few seconds to select an attack because enemies were constantly attacking me, and I often found myself waiting patiently for the game to arbitrarily decide it was my turn to attack again. Well, it seems like the fans of that game in the early 90s felt the exact same way and let Sakaguchi know, because this game really does a much better job of its quote-unquote active time battle system. For starters, the active time battle system can be turned off completely. If that was in Final Fantasy IV, the game certainly didn't adequately explain that to the players. Here, there's an NPC that outright tells you that this option is in the game, so that is much appreciated. Even when the active time battle system is turned off, however, the enemies still seem to be able to attack you while you're selecting which turn to use. However, the game definitely seems a lot more lenient this time around. It honestly feels like only the bosses can attack you while you're deciding battle tactics, and the bosses actually have an excuse for being so powerful. I also appreciate the meters found to the right of the character's hit points during battle. In previous games, the turn orders seemed almost completely arbitrary, but in this game, your characters can attack once their meter on the far right fills all the way up. No more waiting patiently until the game decides you can attack again. Now, you know exactly how long you'll have to wait. Much like the active time battle system itself, this feature can also be turned off. However, in my experience, it seems that all that really does is disable the meter's visibility, not disable its functionality. It still seems that you have to wait for your character's turn to attack. It just is once again as arbitrary as in Final Fantasy IV. I mentioned the bosses, and they really are hit or miss. Some of these bosses are just regular enemies with higher health pools and stronger attacks, but a few of them have gimmicks that try to shake things up. The problem is that most of these gimmicks are either really cliché, although in all fairness they probably weren't as cliché back in 1992 when this game was first released, or they just slow the battles pacing down to a crawl. For example, the boss in the Island Shrine splits himself into 4 copies. Only one of them is the real guy. Gee, I wonder where I've seen that boss gimmick before, except in the literal hundreds of other RPGs that used that boss gimmick. Meanwhile, some gimmicks aren't nearly as cliché as that one, but that's probably because after this game tried them, it became pretty clear that they don't make the boss fights more fun, but instead just make them a drudge. The very first boss in the game is probably the worst example of this. He cycles between 2 phases during the boss fight, offensive and defensive. When he's in his offensive mode, he really just functions like a regular enemy with higher stats, but when he's in his defensive mode, he covers his front with his wings. Any attacks you make off him bounce off him and damage you instead, so the battle literally just becomes to a screeching halt when he does this. Now, if this were a battle at some later point in the game, I would probably take this respite in the fight to heal up. Drink some power drinks in order to buff up character stats, get myself ready for round 2. The problem with that strategy, however, is that this is the first boss fight of the game. I literally don't have any items to use or any spells to cast, either white or black magic. So at this early a point in the game, I spend this boss's defensive phase literally doing nothing. I'm not taking damage, I'm not inflicting damage, I'm literally just waiting for him to get out of his defensive phase so that something can actually happen again. Who the hell thought that was a good idea? Well, I know one thing, Sakaguchi was this game's director, meaning he was the one with final say in the matter. So regardless of whose idea it was initially, it is still this guy's fault that this problem made the final cut. But that just transitions me to the biggest problem with the boss fight gimmicks. They don't really make the boss fights more fun, which is the only thing any game design choice should ever seek to do. For example, the boss, Omniscient, will restart the battle if you use any non-magic attacks on him. That just means you don't use physical attacks, which in turn means you have fewer options to progress forward. Just think about that for a minute. Most boss gimmicks seek only to limit your ability to take them down, but offer next to nothing to compensate for this limitation. That is not fun. That's just arbitrarily forcing you into a playstyle you may not be entirely comfortable with for a single battle, which only makes the game less fun to play, not more. When you think about it that way, maybe the bosses would be better off if they really were just regular enemies with higher stats. The job system from Final Fantasy III makes a return here. Unlike in Final Fantasy IV, characters' jobs are not immutable. Like in Final Fantasy III, they can be changed at will. However, unlike in Final Fantasy III, there is actually an incentive to experiment with the new types of jobs. See, in 3, once you found the jobs you were most comfortable with, you were encouraged to stick with those jobs for the rest of the game. But in this game, when you level up a job, you gain new abilities attached to that job. With each job, you have one primary ability, which you can't change, but you also unlock secondary abilities which can be changed at will, and more importantly, which can be applied even to jobs that don't correspond to the job that unlocked the ability. So, for example, say I want one of my characters to be a white mage. I grind up that person's job and gain the white mage secondary ability. Then, let's say I want to switch that person to now be a thief. I can still give that person the secondary white magic ability, so that person will still be the healer of the group. This encourages you to try out new jobs, because there's little investment for each job. Not only can you change the jobs at will if you decide you don't like playing as one, but you don't even lose the abilities you otherwise would have lost by switching out the job you previously had. By removing negative consequences for experimenting, you are encouraged to experiment. The only problem with this, however, is that the bear job, the job you start the game with, is honestly the best job. It allows you to equip any weapons and armor in the game, making it an even better warrior class than the actual warrior class. But it also allows you to equip not one, but 2 secondary abilities. Sure, this comes at the expense of having no primary ability, but primary abilities can't be changed anyway, so it's not like you're lost anything. Because of this, I quickly found myself just unlocking the various job abilities as soon as these jobs became available to me, and then immediately switching back to Bear since that offered the most versatility. Bear really should have been the least viable option for playing the game, not the most viable. My biggest gripe with this game's non-combat gameplay is how the game so often throws you into the vast empty void with nary a clue what to do next. There have been several instances where I have just completed a dungeon and advanced the story, am told to go and do something else, but the game does not give me the slightest idea where to go to do that something else. Take for example this moment. I just managed to repair the fire ship. Sid and Mid are telling me to go and find the Earth Crystal and stop it from being shattered. Only problem is, they have no idea where the Earth Crystal even is. So, how do I make the story advance? Well, by sailing to the southeastern tip of the game map, reaching this location known as Crescent Town, which is on a crescent-shaped island. Ha! And when I enter this town, an earthquake happens, which destroys the ship, forcing me to enter the nearby woods and get a black chocobo, who honestly looks more purple than black, so I can fly back to the mainland, return to the Library of the Ancients, and then Sid and Mid can ensure me that they'll just build another fire ship for me. In the meantime, Arena's father is alive and was last seen at the town of Ruin, so now and only now does the game tell me go to this specific location to advance the story. How the fuck was I supposed to know that's what I needed to do without an online guide to help me? Considering that I essentially just go in one great big circle, which brings me back to the Library of Ancients, which is where I just departed from, this entire sequence just seems like a complete waste of time anyway. Couldn't you have just had Sid and Mid tell us to go find the Earth Crystal, and then as soon as they said that, some nameless guard from Tycoon Castle charges in, wheezy and out of breath, telling Princess Arena that her father had been spotted going into the town of Ruin? We could have cut out the entire section involving Crescent Town and the totally not purple Chocobo entirely, and virtually nothing would have been lost. Hell, was it really so important that the not purple Chocobo be introduced? This is literally the only time he is ever required in the game, so it honestly feels like he has to be introduced simply because he's part of the Final Fantasy formula, and we have to find a way to have him in the game in some capacity. Except that he isn't part of the Final Fantasy formula, at least not the black variety. The Black Chocobo has so far appeared in exactly one Final Fantasy game, and that was Final Fantasy IV. The Yellow Chocobo has appeared in every Final Fantasy game except the first one, but the Yellow Chocobo has already been featured in this game as Bartz's loyal steed. So it was absolutely not necessary to shoehorn in a Black Chocobo cameo simply to adhere to formula. For that matter, why does Final Fantasy even need a formula in the first place? I thought the whole reason Sakaguchi decided to make the Final Fantasy franchise into an anthology series was specifically so he wouldn't find himself bound by pre-existing lore and mythos. And if you thought that was the only time in the game where you were expected to find your own path with absolutely no direction from the game itself, oh boy, you were flat wrong. See, in the second half of the game, you're not hunting for crystal shrines, you're hunting for lithographs to unlock the legendary weapons. These lithographs are found at the conclusion of 4 different dungeons. The only problem is the game gives you no idea where these dungeons are even located. Look at this. Here I'm running around on Boko, Bartz's pet Chocobo I mentioned earlier, and I'm running around like a chicken with my head cut off. Now, would you believe me when I tell you this isn't even me? No, seriously, this is footage from the long play I used as a guide for my own playthrough of the game. Think about this for a minute. This game is so cryptic and so directionless that even the online guides designed to show me what to do often have no clue what the fuck they're supposed to do. Wrap your head around that if you can. Now, I know what you're thinking. Isn't there some kind of world map you can use to figure out where to go? Well, yes, there technically is a world map, but there's only one chance to get it in the whole game. See, there's this dungeon pretty early in the game called the Ship Graveyard. At one point in that dungeon, you have the ability to obtain a world map. However, once you've completed the Ship Graveyard, you can never return to the Ship Graveyard. This means that if you fail to get the map at that point, you can never get it again. You have to just go the rest of the game entirely mapless. Fuck you! And to top it all off, even the menus fail to give the player vital information about the game. Yes, even the menus, which literally exist for no other purpose than to convey pure information, still keep everything as cryptic as possible. For example, some weapons and armor have unique effects beyond just doing more damage or whatnot. What exactly do these weapons and armor do? You have to actually experiment with the weapons and armor to find out. What about the spells? What does each spell do? Well, try each one out because the game sure as hell isn't going to just tell you what the spells do. Once again, we turn to the game I grew up with, Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars, to show them how it's done. In that game, every consumable item, every equipable accessory, every spell you can cast comes with a brief description of just what the fuck they actually do. What does the wake-up pin do? Oh, it prevents sleep and mute status ailments. With a name like Wake-Up Pin, I would expect it to prevent sleep, but it also prevents mute, which isn't quite as obvious, so I very much appreciate the game outright telling me that it also prevents mute. Meanwhile, what does the maple syrup do? It restores 40 FP. What does Geno Boost do? It boosts your attack power. Wham bam, thank you ma'am. The game, not never, but rarely, leaves me high and dry and expects me to just figure out for myself what each item does, which is something this game could seriously learn from. So while the sense of direction in this game is an abject failure across the board, one aspect of this game's gameplay that is at least hit or miss is the sense of progression. Whenever we reach a crystal, we fail to prevent it from blowing up, so instead the crystal shards are absorbed into our bodies, which unlock new jobs for us to grind up, so we can unlock new abilities. I actually really like this mechanic. By reaching the crystals, we are progressing the story, and by unlocking new jobs, we are progressing in gameplay. This means that story progression and gameplay progression are one in the same. Compare that to The Legend of Zelda, which typically provides you with a heart container and a story MacGuffin for completing a dungeon. The story MacGuffin helps to progress the story, but it on its own doesn't do anything. This means that to reward the player for going through the dungeon, the game typically provides a heart container to provide a sense of gameplay progression. The gameplay reward and the story reward are two completely different items. You can, and many in fact do, actively forego the heart container when they complete a dungeon in favor of doing 3 heart runs. But here, story and gameplay progression are one in the same, which is a concept I really like. However, one way this game does not handle progression well is in its modes of transportation. The game destroys ships on a regular basis. At the start of the game, the wind stops, which is apparently a big deal in this world even if it only happens for a minute. This means that the vast majority of ships cannot sail, so to travel in this game you need ships that have alternate means of moving in this game besides wind. However, they don't just pick one method of transport and stick with it, oh no. Throughout the entire game you go through a total of 5 different ships, 2 of which can fly and 3 of which can sink below the ocean surface, 2 dragons, and 2 chocobos. It's honestly quite dizzying how many different methods you have of getting around. More importantly, there's only so many ways you can introduce a new ship before you eventually run out of excuses as to how it can move without wind. The first ship you acquire is pulled by a giant sea monster called the Hydra. When the Hydra dies, that method of moving the ship goes out the window. What do you do after that? A ship that's powered by fire. Oh, but then that ship gets destroyed in an earthquake. Third ship? Well, it basically has helicopter blades on top of it so it can fly. Eventually this is going to get contrived. There's only so many different ways you can provide an explanation for how a ship can move without wind before we start to roll our eyes at it. Well, by the time the 5th and final ship rolls around, it seems that Sakaguchi just gave up the pretense entirely. Because we literally get a ship that handed to us that came from nowhere. Nobody is on board the ship. It literally just sails its own damn self up to the shore for us to board. I was honestly expecting the boat to have a note taped to its captain's wheel saying, "You need a boat? Here's a boat for you. Yours truly, the game developers." Because that's basically what this boat is, a completely out of nowhere Deus Ex Machina that was given to us on a silver platter with absolutely no rhyme, reason, or context behind it, because Sakaguchi just decided, fuck it, I'm tired of coming up with explanations. Last but not least, let's talk about the dungeons themselves. In the past retrospectives, I've complained about how the dungeons are little more than blank, empty mazes with monsters in them. And since there were also monsters in the overworld, that basically means the dungeons were nothing more than blank, empty mazes compared to the overworld. Well, in this game, it honestly feels like there was the most token of attempts to move beyond that and actually introduce something resembling a puzzle in some of the dungeons. For example, when I'm going through the poop deck of the fighter ship, trying to clear out the engine room and make it ready for sailing, there are some levers that I have to pull that cause the floor to move. Depending on where the floor is, I can either set up a bridge to progress, or I fall down to a lower level. Meanwhile, the Library of the Ancients has a section where there are some movable bookcases. By moving these bookcases, I can block some paths while opening up others. The sand tides are moving, and by stepping on one of the moving sections, I can be forced into one direction until the game decides to plant me back on solid ground. Meanwhile, the Island Shrine has a maze of air ducts, and where I end up after traveling through the air ducts is dependent on the status of two binary switches in this tiny room. These are all great ideas, at least in theory. The problem is that Sakaguchi doesn't take these ideas and really run with them. These puzzles, for lack of a better term, are ridiculously simple. For example, the Island Shrine air duct maze was a great idea in theory, but the fact that your destination is controlled by only two switches, and both of those switches are completely binary, means that there's only 4 destinations you could possibly end up. Likewise, all the other puzzle mechanics I mentioned earlier sound like great ideas for puzzles, but the only instances of these mechanics we get in the game honestly feel like tutorials for the puzzle mechanics rather than fully realized puzzles. I'd imagine that a game like Zelda would have taken these mechanics and just really cranked them up and given us some real brain benders. As it stands, I'm left especially disappointed by Final Fantasy V in this regard, because I'm left wondering what could have been. So, overall, the gameplay in this game is mostly mediocre. The mechanic whereby job progression is tied directly to story progression is the only real triumph of this game. Everything else is either an abject failure or a mere concept that the game never takes full advantage of. However, all sins are forgiven when you take into account this game's story and characters. That leads me to... Okay, I said all sins are forgiven when you take the story into consideration, but there is one thing I should probably point out that I don't like about the story before we get to the really juicy stuff. You may recall from my Final Fantasy II retrospective that I criticized that game for having terrible pacing because it was attempting to rip off the plot of the original Star Wars trilogy in a fantasy setting, but in doing so, compressed 3 movies worth of plot into one game, causing the pacing to suffer horribly as a result. Well, that problem rears its ugly head here as well. While I cannot, this time around, identify any popular movies or other pop culture that this game's plot seems to be inspired by, the game still feels like its own sequel. It feels like it was one story and its sequel stitched together into a single game, causing the pacing to suffer as a result. Think about it this way. The first third of the game has us going around Bart's, Rena's, and Ferris's world, searching for the 4 crystals and trying to prevent them from exploding. We are ultimately unsuccessful in this quest, causing Exdeath to be released from captivity. Exdeath then retires to his own world, Galveth and Kryl in hot pursuit, with Bart's, Rena, and Ferris soon to follow. The second third of this game has us questing around Galveth's world, ultimately culminating in us storming Exdeath's castle and defeating Exdeath, resulting in us being deposited back into our own world through, at the time, unknown means. This feels like the first half of a 2-parter. Think about it. Exdeath's castle looks like a final dungeon. It feels like a final dungeon. Even the music sounds like that of a final dungeon. The battle against Exdeath feels like a climax. Then, when we get transported back to our own world, this feels like falling action. We spent a little time celebrating the peace we worked so hard for. This feels like it should have cut to end credits here. Then, we meet up with Bako once more, and he reveals that he's got himself a girlfriend who is now pregnant. We are once again in the exposition phase of the story, which in typical 3-act structures is typically reserved for the first act. In other words, we're back in the first act of the story, meaning that this is a second plot after the first plot has been resolved. We begin this second plot with only Bartz and Kryl in our party, but then Ferris rejoins the party, followed eventually by Rena. Again, this feels like the beginning of a typical RPG story where we start the game with a small party only to build it to max size over time. We also learn the exposition about how the two worlds used to be one and the same, but they were split thanks to the power of the crystals, and now they have merged back together. Again, this is exposition, which, as I mentioned earlier, is typically reserved for the first act. Oh, and Exdeath reveals that he's actually alive, posing as a thorn until the moment to strike arrived. This is a second inciting incident. We then quest all around the newly merged world searching for lithographs so we can unseal the 12 legendary weapons and use them to defeat Exdeath. This is clearly the midpoint of the second plot. In the first plot, the middle consisted of us trying and failing to prevent the destruction of the 4 crystals. Here, it consists of us questing for the lithographs. Then, our trek through the end zone is a second third act, culminating in a second battle with Exdeath, a second climax, and then a second falling action where the heroes enjoy their hard-earned peace. As you can see, this game is clearly a first story and its sequel, having been duct-taped together for no good reason. Sakaguchi had 2 plots worth of story to tell with this game, but since he insisted that the Final Fantasy series be an anthology series, that means he can't just make a direct sequel to this game. Even though they eventually did do that with Final Fantasy X-2 and Final Fantasy XIII-2, but that was years after Sakaguchi was no longer actively involved in game development. So instead of just making 2 games, he instead just put both games together. The net result is a story that is paced like complete shit, and which doesn't end when it's natural and organic for it to end. Okay, now that I've got the bad stuff out of the way, let's talk about what makes this story so great. You may recall from my Final Fantasy I retrospective that I found it rather annoying that the game completely failed to address what would happen if any of the 4 crystals got destroyed during one of the Light Warrior's many battles. I also criticized Final Fantasy III for teasing such a subplot only to never follow up on it. Well, I cannot say that about Final Fantasy V. After the Wind Crystal is destroyed, Bartz asks Rena what the destruction of the crystals would entail, and Rena explains that the world's existence is dependent on the crystals. Without the crystals, the elements to which they are tied would cease to exist. That's why the wind stopped whenever the Wind Crystal was destroyed, leading to the aforementioned problem of having to find ways of moving their boats without any wind. Later, after the Earth Crystal is destroyed, we see that the sand tides, which provided the conveyor belt puzzle I mentioned earlier, have stopped moving. While this allows us to reach the pyramids in the center of the sand tides much more easily, it also is a foreboding confirmation that the world is about to end without the crystals. Because of their importance, the crystals are, as I suggested in the Final Fantasy I retrospective, under the care and protection of 4 of the most powerful governments in the world at the time. So this game finally takes the problems I mentioned in the first game and actually addresses those problems through world building. However, the governments that hold and protect the crystals are doing a lot more than just keeping the crystals safe. It turns out that the crystals also serve as perpetual energy generators, and by harvesting the energy they generate, they are able to substantially improve the standard of living for people on this planet. For example, in Crescent Town, they have consistently bountiful harvests every year despite a lack of rainfall and without even so much as irrigation. They attribute this bountiful harvest to the exceptionally rich soil, which is most likely enriched by the power of the Earth Crystal. However, there are two problems with the countries using their crystals in this manner, and these two problems form the basis for the two main themes of this game's story. The first problem is that, because the crystals have recently produced significantly less power output than they used to, most likely because a good chunk of their power was being used to hold X-Death in his prison, they have started using Cid's technology to amplify the crystal's energy output. This, however, has the effect of putting the crystals under extreme strain, which is what's causing the crystals to burst in the first place. As the King of Walls, who looks after the water crystal, points out, the energy provided by the crystals is essential to maintaining their way of life. So by overloading the crystals and causing them to burst, they are essentially doomed to die out. This is the first of the main themes. It is clearly a parallel to our real-world dependence on natural resources to support our own way of life in real life. Especially in developed countries like Japan or the United States, our way of life can charitably be described by those in third world countries as excessively gluttonous. Well, in the pursuit of more and more natural resources to sustain our way of life, we are tearing our planet apart. As we constantly drill for more oil, dig for more metals, and burn more and more fossil fuels, eventually the Earth will reach its breaking point and become either uninhabitable or borderline uninhabitable. This seems like an artistic representation of that real-life problem. The King of Walls is aware of the risk of the crystal breaking because of the pressure that is being applied to it, but they are too accustomed to the energy it provides to give it up at the drop of a hat, and he ends up paying the ultimate price for his refusal to see reason. Then we have the Kingdom of Karnak, which looks after the Fire Crystal. Like the Kingdom of Walls, these guys are using Cid's technology to amplify the crystal's energy output, resulting in the crystal being destroyed thanks to all the strain, just like the water crystal before it. However, unlike the Kingdom of Walls, Cid manages to find an alternative way to power the fire ship without needing to siphon energy from the fire crystal. We learn about this alternative method by hitting the bugs at the Library of the Ancients. This means that, long ago, the people of this world had their own ways of doing things, but then it was discovered that the crystals could be used as perpetual energy generators, providing multiple times as much energy to the people while requiring a fraction as much manual labor from the people. Those older methods of doing things quickly became obsolete, as the people could now just rely on the crystals to wipe their asses for them. At least until the crystals burst. Then we're in deep shit. This leads us to the second main theme of this story, warning against the dangers of over-reliance on automation, especially when it's a single piece of automation you're relying on, and the loss of that single piece of automation means the literal end of the world. I would like to think that after Neo-Ink's death is defeated and peace is restored to the world, the people of the world will hopefully go back to using the ancient methods of getting stuff done, as documented in the Temple of the Ancients. It may require a lot more manual labor on their end to maintain, but at least they wouldn't be risking the destruction of their entire planet by putting enormous strain on the things their planet needs in order to survive. Yeah, it's probably bullshit, and it's just my nonsense interpretation, but hey, that's just what I personally took out of this game's plot. If you have your own interpretations of the story, feel free to post them in the comments. That said, this just makes the second half of this game, you know, the sequel to the first story that got duct taped on for no good reason, all the more disappointing. There was a clear environmentalist message in the first half of the game, but the second half doesn't seem to have any main theme about it. All we're doing in the second half is searching for lithographs to unlock the legendary weapons. There's no indication that taking these lithographs or taking these weapons would have any adverse effect on anybody's way of life. There's no balancing the wants of the people against the need for the world to survive. It just seems rather half-assed compared to the ingenious themes and symbolism that comes from the first half of the game. Bartz is the character you start the game as. For the first time in the series, you have the option of naming the first character you play as, but not any of the other characters. In the first 3 Final Fantasy games, you had the option of naming all 4 main characters. In Final Fantasy IV, all characters came with names out of the box, but you had the option of renaming them at designated spots. For this game, 4 of the 5 playable characters have preset names that cannot be changed at all. But with the first character, you were prompted early on to give him a name, and once you've given him that name, you can't change the name after that. I, however, will simply be calling this guy Bartz, since that's his canon name, and calling him anything else will likely just cause confusion. Bartz has very little in the way of character development. He's basically the game's audience surrogate straight man. He's the eyes and ears through which the other characters' interactions are observed. He's a nomad who travels the world with his pet Jacobo named Bako. He has no destination in his travels, but instead is just fulfilling his parents' dying wish for him to see the world. Because he has no attachments to any place, thing, or person, except maybe Bako, he is the perfect candidate to simply drop everything and go off on this adventure to save the world, seeing as he has so little to drop in the first place. Now, here's something I don't get about Bartz. Boko, his pet Jacobo, is featured prominently in the game's official artwork on Steam. Meanwhile, Rena, Ferris, Galuf, and Kryl are not featured in the artwork at all. So you would think that Boko plays a very large role in the game's story, right? However, we really only interact with Bako twice. Once at the start of the game, and once more at the halfway point during what feels like the start of the sequel story. Sure, we also need him to be able to enter the Waterfall Shrine, but that shrine is optional to complete the game, and even then we only really need him for his ability to swim. He's basically the canoe from the first 3 games, a means of traveling across rivers, not an actual character. Rena is the princess of the Kingdom of Tycoon. Like Bartz, she never undergoes any real character development, but unlike Bartz, she at least has a personality. And it's a personality I really don't like. She is benevolent and trusting to a fault. Now, normally I like benevolence in my heroes. I like a protagonist in a story who commits to saving the world for no other reason than because it's the right thing to do. But Rena just takes it to a whole new stratosphere of stupid. She will risk her own life to save people, even when risking her own life is totally not necessary. For example, there's a subplot where Galuf's royal dragon is wounded and needs some dragon grass in order to get better. Naturally, we go and fetch the dragon grass for it. Now, that I don't have a problem with. However, when we reach the dragon grass, we find that it's evolved to become self-aware and can fight back against us.
Does this look inanimate to you, punk?
We speculate that this might be the reason why dragons have become endangered. Well, they say extinct, but they aren't really extinct. If even one dragon is still alive, they are not extinct, they are only endangered. So when we take the dragon grass back to the dragon, it's understandably afraid of it. Rena, being a dumbass, decides to eat some of it herself to prove that it's already dead and can't harm him. She does this knowing it's poisonous to humans, and then she collapses and nearly dies from poisoning herself. She sure is one lucky bimbo that Kryl just happened to have an antidote on hand, because she would have gotten a well-earned Darwin Award otherwise. Her naivety is present almost from the start of the game. Recall that because the wind has stopped, they need a ship that can move without wind. Lo and behold, they just happen to find one. Only problem is, it's owned by pirates. They sneak on board the ship and attempt to sail away with it, but can't for some reason. When they get cornered by the pirates, Rena actually attempts to negotiate with them, even revealing herself to be the Princess of Tycoon, as if that would have given her some additional bargaining power with fucking pirates. Needless to say, the pirates proceed to take them prisoner, expect them to hold for, well, a king's ransom. All I can say is she got really super lucky that this pirate's captain just happened to be her long-lost sister, otherwise she would have been royally fucked in the ass. All throughout the game, Rena comes off as completely incompetent. As a princess, I can understand that she was raised to be benevolent and compassionate, but that should not have come at the expense of her common sense or even her own sense of survival. As a future monarch in training, she should know better than to negotiate with fucking pirates and expect them to just do as she says simply because she's the princess. They're pirates. They don't follow your sovereignty, bitch. Speaking of her long-lost sister, that leads me to Ferris. She's the captain of the pirate crew that Bartz, Rena, and Galuf attempt to steal the ship of. For the first few hours of the game, she hides the fact that she's actually a woman. The jig is up when they have to swim underwater for a little bit, and then have to change out of their wet clothes. Rena goes into a private room to change, and since we already know she's a girl, we accept that of her. The boys change in front of each other, but because Ferris is pretending to be a boy, she has to change in front of them, thereby revealing her true gender. The reason she gives for why she hid her sex from the group is because pirates aren't receptive to having a woman on the crew. I honestly have to scratch my head at this. In Final Fantasy II, Leela was a pirate captain who never hid her true gender, and the crew seemed to accept her leadership just fine. Now sure, that isn't really a plot hole in this game, since Final Fantasy is an anthology. That means that every game takes place in its own world. So you could argue that the pirates in this world are sexist, while those in Final Fantasy II's world are not sexist. However, this game still seems to adhere to an internal consistency. When we meet the King of Walls, for example, we are told that he is the king. The word king carries with it certain expectations of what we expect out of him. We have kings in the real world, so we expect this guy's social status, the sovereign power he holds, and the level of propriety he conducts himself with to be on par with what we would expect of kings. Likewise, because these guys are called pirates, that instantly sets some expectations in our minds for how they should behave and conduct themselves. When they take Rena, Bartz, and Galuf prisoner and plan to hold them for ransom, we expect them to do that because they're pirates. When we sail up to Tool Village, the pirate crew heads to the nearby pub in search of rum. Again, we expect them to do that because they're pirates. Well, you can't change it up now just because you need a contrived excuse for why Ferris would pretend to be a man. If you want them to be pirates, you need to have them act like pirates. I already know what some of you are thinking. Pirates have historically been sexist in the past. Many pirate ships explicitly forbade women on board. Yes, they did. However, that typically only applied to women being allowed on board in the first place. There is no historical records that women, in the rare event they were ever allowed to be pirates in the first place, were treated as anything but fairly by the rest of the crew. The few pirate ships that allowed women on board typically gave those women equal opportunity to advance in rank to those of the men. So if Ferris had joined a sexist pirate crew, how would she have even been allowed on board in the first place? Right now, some of you are thinking, well, they didn't know she was a woman either. Well, I find that hard to believe. See, in this game, her true gender was revealed when she was forced to change clothes in front of the boys because her previous clothes had become soaking wet. You're telling me that in her entire life as a pirate, where she spends the majority of her time surrounded on all sides by the sea, that she never once got splashed by a tidal wave or a whale's tail? You're telling me that she never once had to change out of wet clothes. Sure, as the captain, she would likely be entitled to her own quarters and therefore could have some privacy while changing, but she didn't start out as the captain of that ship. She obviously started at the bottom and had to work her way to the top. So I find it completely inconceivable that, in her entire career as a pirate, not one member of her crew ever discovered the truth about her. She may have acted like a man around them, but they all knew she was a girl. There was simply no way she could have hid it from them for that long. So her crew elected her to be their captain, knowing full well that she was a woman. Sure, she might have been expected to act like a man, but if you really think about it, what exactly does that mean, act like a man? All that really means is that there are no gender roles whatsoever in pirate culture. Gender roles are already completely arbitrary if you think about it. So no, her pirate crew is not all that sexist, which in turn means that she has no reason to feel ashamed of being a woman. Now, I wouldn't even mind the pirates acting differently than how pirates normally behave if that subversion of audience expectation was actually used to enhance the story. One example I can think of off the top of my head that handled this kind of subversion masterfully was Blade 2. In that movie, the character of Nisa was a vampire. Now, vampires are typically viewed by most audiences as inherently antagonistic. The minute someone is established to be a vampire, we automatically assume they're evil. Well, Nisa subverts this audience expectation. She sucks blood because she has to suck blood in order to survive. She doesn't like the fact that she has to kill innocent people to survive, but she doesn't have a choice. She didn't choose to be a vampire, she was born that way. She can't help but be who she is. That's an example where audience expectations of how a certain character trope should behave is cleverly subverted and does so in a way that enhances the story by giving sympathy to the villains. Here, the sexism of Ferris's pirate crew serves no real narrative purpose other than to give her an excuse to hide her true sex from her new companions, so we can have a big reveal later on about her actually being a woman. However, we don't really need her to hide her sex from her new companions in order to have this big reveal. Remember, as a pirate, the rest of her crew probably knew she was a woman but still expected her to act like a man, whatever the hell that means. Also remember that when Rena pleaded with the pirates to lend her their ship, Bartz and Galef were just as surprised as the pirates to learn that Rena was the Princess of Tycoon. Her excuse for not telling them was she never meant to hide it. Well, Ferris's femininity could have worked the exact same way. Her new companions were surprised to find out she was a woman? Well, she never explicitly claimed to be a man, did she? She never denied being a woman. She was just acting in a way that is perceived as masculine by landlubber standards because gender roles are bullshit. She could have taken off her soaked shirt next to the fire without any hesitation whatsoever. Bartz and Galef could have then noticed her breasts and exclaimed that she was a woman, and Ferris could have said, "Yeah, your point?" The revelation that Ferris was a girl would have been just as shocking as it was in the actual game, but it would have made Ferris and her pirate crew into much more three-dimensional characters. Not to mention, it would have given the story a third main theme in addition to the two environmentalist themes I mentioned earlier. Before I wrap up Ferris's character analysis, I have one last thing I'd like to point out. We see on multiple occasions that she immediately recognizes King Tycoon as her papa. We also see in a flashback that prior to her being lost, she was old enough to run around and speak in grammatically complete sentences. So she was obviously old enough to remember things. Clearly, Ferris remembers her past life as a princess, so that begs the question, why didn't she ever attempt to find her way back home? The only reason she ever reunited with her sister is because, by a 1 in a million chance, Rena just happened to try and steal her pirate ship. She didn't recognize Rena, since Rena would obviously have grown up so much since she last saw her that she wouldn't even be recognizable anymore, but she does immediately recognize Rena's pendant as matching her own. Were it not for that 1 in a million chance of them meeting up, she would never have found her family. But the problem there is that she obviously knew who her family was. So why didn't she just, come back home? Maybe it's because, as we eventually see during the not ending, she just doesn't like the princess's life. So maybe she was contemplated returning home, only to realize that the pirate's life is the path to which she was most suited. But then, at the actual end of the game, she can be seen taking the throne alongside Rena. So that idea is out the window. So I don't get it. Why didn't Ferris try to find her way back home if she knew who she was? So that transitions me to Galuf and Kryl, a grandfather-granddaughter pairing. Since their characters and character arcs are so intertwined with one another, I'll be analyzing them together. For the first third of the game, Galuf has amnesia. This amnesia is used as a rather convenient plot device and not necessarily in a good way. Bit by bit, Galuf begins to recollect some parts of his memory, just as it's convenient to the plot for him to do so. I like that Kryl, his granddaughter, is the one that ultimately jogs his memory completely, but I don't like how his memory prior to this just comes back in bits and pieces right as the plot demands it. It just seems a little too convenient for me. Galuf is a hero through and through. His first big hero moment comes at the end of the ship graveyard. A siren is creating images of people who were important to the protagonists. Bart, Rena, and Ferris each get ensnared by these images, thinking that their loved ones have actually returned, which causes them to fall under the siren's spell. However, because Galuf has amnesia, the only time in this game when his amnesia is actually used for something that isn't extremely convenient, he doesn't recognize Kryl for who she is, and so he isn't tempted to be ensnared by the siren's spell. At this point, he can run away and save himself, but he chooses to stay and revive his new companions. The siren asks why he risks his life for these people, and he actually hesitates. He can't really think of a compelling reason. He ultimately decides that they're his friends, but are they really? He literally just met them. No, he is saving them because it's right. Which, as I mentioned when I was analyzing Rena's character, is always satisfying in a protagonist. However, perhaps the most important moment in Galuf's character's journey is this moment right here. He's back on his home world. He just unlocked the crystals of his world, and X-Death has the 4 warriors ensnared in a death beam, using these crystals as a power source. Now, remember in my Final Fantasy IV retrospective, where I complained about how Edward just developed the psychic ability to tell when his companions were in trouble? Well, that plot device rears its ugly head here, too. Kryl somehow knows that Galuf is in danger and runs off to save him. What's even worse is that this time around there was no need for Kryl to suddenly develop psychic powers. At least in Final Fantasy IV, I can't really think of a readily available alternative way for Edward to know that the group needed his help. Psychic powers may have been credibility strain, but it really was the only way for that scene to work. But here, there is no reason for Kryl to be psychic. Her psychic powers tell her that Galuf is in danger, but she doesn't know where he is. She needs a Kupo, furry white creatures that have the ability to communicate telepathically with each other, to tell her where Galuf is, so she can hop on the Royal Dragon and go save him. Since she was going to rely on the word of a telepathic creature anyway, why couldn't that creature just be the one that tells her that Galuf is in danger in the first place too? She clearly did not need to develop psychic powers out of nowhere to advance the story, and I hope to God this does not become a trope of the Final Fantasy franchise from this point on. I don't have a problem with characters having psychic powers, but when they just randomly pick them up, that just bothers me. So anyway, Kryl comes and tries to save the warriors. However, she doesn't get very far, and Exdeath ends up trapping her in her own force field and starts draining her life force away too. Now, when I played this game for footage, I was thinking to myself, Galuf, you'd better get your ass up! And literally the moment I said that, right on cue, Galuf forces himself to his feet and summons the last of his strength to save his granddaughter's life. Words cannot explain how fucking awesome that moment was. Galuf suddenly becomes supercharged by the force field and becomes powerful enough to stand toe-to-toe with Exdeath by himself. He defeats Exdeath, but then it turns out that the supercharging of his body from the force field ended up tearing his body apart, killing him. Kryl then steps up and takes Galuf's place as a playable character, gaining all of Galuf's experience points, job mastery, and abilities. Now, if you've seen my Final Fantasy 3 and 4 retrospectives, you know that I'm not a huge fan of characters being swapped out for other characters for no reason. I hated how Xande in Final Fantasy 3 was swapped out for the Cloud of Darkness, and I really hated how Zemus in Final Fantasy 4 was swapped out for Zeromus. So you'd probably think I absolutely despise the fact that Galuf gets swapped out for Kryl in this game, right? But if you think that, you'd actually be quite wrong. I despised the character swap-outs in the past 2 games because they happened for no good reason and without proper build-up. In Final Fantasy 3, we defeated Xande, and then the Cloud of Darkness was introduced as a new villain for the sole purpose of extending the game by one more dungeon. In Final Fantasy IV, Zeromus replaced Zemus as the final boss for no conceivable reason whatsoever. It wasn't even done to pad out the game, since we went through the final dungeon expecting to fight Zemus only to get Zeromus instead. That bait and switch didn't work because we had no emotional investment in this new villain. The new character carried absolutely no weight. But here, Galuf's death carries a fucking anvil. Galuf was a main character and a member of our party since the beginning of the game, so we've had plenty of time to get to know him and become invested in him as a character. His death is actually meaningful, as is Kryl replacing him. Zeromus replacing Zemus didn't work at all because we were swapping out a villain who actually had some build-up to him in favor of a completely new guy who we had never met or even heard of before. Kryl, by contrast, has been a fairly active supporting character in the game up to this point. She has saved our butts on multiple occasions up to this point, so her promotion to main character status is very much earned. That's all I ask for in a character swapping. All I ask is that it be used to enhance the story rather than just pad the game out or happen for no reason at all. So that just leaves one final main character for me to analyze, and that's the main villain of the game, the evil Lord Exdeath. Exdeath is not a very deep villain, he just wants power for its own sake, which is about as cliché a villain motive as you could possibly get. However, it's the way he's ultimately defeated that makes him interesting. For once, Sakaguchi didn't feel the need to swap out main villains for no conceivable reason. The main villain in this game is Exdeath, and it remains Exdeath from beginning to end. After you defeat him in the end zone, he merges with the Void and becomes Neo Exdeath, but I would hardly call that a new villain. Rather, I would call that a second form of the same villain. But even if you insist on calling Neo Exdeath a new villain entirely, I would still be in favor of this new villain, because as I hinted at a moment ago, this villain swap-out is done in a way that actually enhances the story rather than just existing to pad out the game. All throughout the game, Exdeath's main goal has been to open up the end zone, release the army of monsters trapped inside, and then use those monsters to secure the power of the Void for himself. The Void is an abstract force that supposedly has the power to suck up all of existence inside it. However, after we defeat regular Exdeath, he suddenly realizes that he isn't quite as in control of the Void as he initially thought. Rather than controlling the power of the Void, he is instead consumed by it. It is clear based on the dialogue that this isn't what he wanted to happen any more than the protagonists, but he can't stop himself from being consumed by the Void. See, when Exdeath wanted to seize the power of the Void and destroy the world with it, he wanted to create a new world of darkness in its place, one where the monsters in the End Zone would rule. However, that's not what the Void does. The Void is only interested in destruction, not creation. The Void wants to destroy all of existence, and that's it. So when Exdeath becomes Neo-Exdeath, he no longer cares about creating a world of darkness. He wants to erase everything and then erase himself forever. As I said before, Exdeath himself is not a considerably deep or complex villain, but I always find it satisfying when a villain is hoisted by his own petard. Exdeath's is the story of a villain who wanted ultimate power, believed he was more in control of his weapon than he thought, bit off more than he could chew, and in the process paid the ultimate price for his hubris. Hot damned. Final Fantasy V is the best Final Fantasy game I've played to date. The story had not one, but two interesting main themes. The main villain was hoisted by his own petard, which is always satisfying in a villain. For once, Sakaguchi didn't swap out main villains for no good reason. When characters died, it actually gave the story weight rather than just adding artificial drama. Also, unlike in Final Fantasy IV, the game didn't feel the need to pointlessly retcon deaths for no reason and therefore undermine the drama. The game is not perfect. I hope I have done a good job today highlighting the game's many flaws, but there is no such thing as a perfect game, and this game, while not perfect, was a hell of a lot of fun. For all of these reasons and more, it should come as no surprise that I rank Final Fantasy V at the top of the list so far, above Final Fantasy II. This was Sakaguchi's last chance to make a lasting impression on the Final Fantasy franchise, and he went out with a whopper. Next time, I will do a retrospective analysis of the last of the 2D Final Fantasy games, as well as the beginning of the Katase era, Final Fantasy VI. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed this retrospective, please hit that subscribe button for more videos just like it. Also, if you enjoyed my content overall, please consider supporting the channel directly, either with Patreon support or channel memberships. Silver and Gold level members and Patreon supporters are allowed to submit requests for video topics, and Gold members and Patreon supporters are allowed to directly assign me video topics that I am guaranteed to cover. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later. Peace!